Hey, have you ever wanted to get better at UHC? Well, if you clicked on this video, your answer is probably yes. In this video, I'll be going through everything you need to know to become Tier 2 in UHC PvP. This includes, but is not limited to, your melee, secondaries, Gamesense, and Playstyles. There will be 3 segments to this video, starting with beginners who are around Tier 5 to Tier 4 skill, all the way up to advanced players who are just about to get Tier 2 skill but need a little extra push. If you don't want to watch the entire video, I labeled each segment by chapter, so you can save time by just skipping to your part. However, if you're a beginner trying to go all the way to an advanced level, I highly recommend you watch the whole thing, as a lot of the terms I'll be using in the later parts are covered right here at the beginning. One last thing before we start, if you'd like to ask me any questions about my settings, texture packs, or anything at all, join my Discord down in the description and ping me with a message. I don't reply to random DMs, so that's kind of the only way you can get to me. Anyways, without further ado, let's get started with our beginner melee. Melee is probably the easiest part of being a beginner. As a beginner, your only goal with melee will be to deal damage to the opponent. Later on, you'll need to try and incorporate more hits for knockback as opposed to damage. But for now, you're good to start with a heavy damage playstyle. There are a few main melee techniques that you should implement as a beginner. The first one, and the most important technique in all of Minecraft, is attribute swapping. This is the easiest way to break a shield. Simply hold out your sword, switch to your axe, and very slightly after, left click the shield. Either you get a full power attack or you get the shield break, which is what you're aiming for. The next technique is a crit chain. A crit chain is the fastest way to get damage on your opponent. Simply chain multiple critical hits together in a row. The issue with this is your opponent is probably not going to just let you do this. However, there are other techniques which will help you get the opportunities for these chains. One of these examples is momentum breaking. Momentum breaking is an amazing way to get a good crit chain on your opponent. Here's how it works. You want to get as close to your opponent as you can to crit them or to break their shield with an attribute swap. Then, if you get the shield break, go for the crit chain while holding up your shield in between hits until it's broken or you're hit off. If you get a critical hit, keep attribute swapping until you get the shield break, then go for your crit chain. Basically, just try and reduce your knockback as much as possible, get as close to the opponent as possible, and go for major damage. Your secondaries as a beginner can have a way bigger impact than as an advanced player, because players are going to struggle to get out of your utilities more. Worse players are going to have a harder time getting out of webs and extinguishing themselves from fire damage. Playing for your utilities, just trying to make your game harder for your opponent in general, is a really good strategy in the lower levels of gameplay. Beginner Gamesense is pretty simple. There's only a few things you need to know that I'll be talking about. First, your healing. This is the only time I'll be talking about it very much, as healing basically comes as a necessity for the other stages. But basically, your goal in UHC is not to end the match as quick as possible, but rather to try and win as much as possible. What I'm trying to say is, you really shouldn't be playing too low on health just to try and get a drop on your opponent unless you're super confident. Try to create a small amount of distance to heal on a good amount of health, whether it's a knockback hit, water bucket, or other form of utility. You're not going to see many different playstyles at a beginner level. In this segment, I'll be talking about an aggressive and a passive playstyle, and we'll get more into the details in the later segments. First, an aggressive playstyle in the lower levels is honestly pretty easily stopped by things like webs and lavas. These players don't know how to get around these as much as they're beginners. I mean, they're not really good at the game, but regardless. For passive playstyles, you want to try and inch towards them very slowly in a kind of back and forth motion to try and bait out some form of utility. Once you bait out some form of utility and get rid of it, you can try a block aggro, an aggressive play where you place 1 or 2 blocks under your feet to avoid all the opponent's utility, going right over it and going for a momentum break once you land. Intermediate melee gets a little more complicated. This is the point where you want to start playing for combos and stuns. A stun is where you click the opponent's shield twice. The purpose of this is for the first click to break the opponent's shield, and the second is to send them very slightly upwards. You can chain a lot of utility after the stun, but we'll get to that in a later part. Your goal with melee is to put yourself in a favorable spot to deal more damage. You shouldn't be using your melee to set up your secondaries, but rather you should be using your secondaries to set up your melee. Intermediate secondaries are where you're going to start seeing things like drains, stun webs, double webs, and stun lavas. A drain is where you use a lava, web, or empty bucket to take the water off of their web. This makes it so the player in the web has to grab another water bucket from the inventory, giving you time to do even more damage. Stun webs and stun lavas are pretty simple. It's simply just doing a stun and then placing a lava or a web below their feet right after. This is probably the most consistent way to get somebody in a piece of utility. A double web is another mechanic that seems pretty simple but can be very effective. How this works is simple. Once you get your opponent in a web, you'd simply just place another one on the top. What this could do is a few things. The first thing you could do is prevent the opponent from watering on the ground next to the web, because there's still going to be one on their head. Another thing you could do is drain the water the opponent places on top of the web. The last thing you could do is draw out the amount of time it takes for the water they place to remove the webs they're in. Since there's two webs and the water is way higher up, it takes more time to flow down and they take more time to get out of the web. This last scenario is probably the worst one and the least rewarding, but it's still a pretty solid one if the opponent's in the right spot. Intermediate game sense isn't a skill that's necessarily taught, more one that's developed over time. However, in this segment, I'll be teaching you a few tricks to help improve that game sense. First, if you're healing in a spot where you could save health, try scratching off that inch of HP you could save if you just spent a bit more time before eating and healing. For example, in this engagement, you see me healing at a very unopportunistic time. I'm taking a lot of damage and the golden apple is basically not doing anything. But in this clip, you can see that if I just spent a little more time and create a little more space before immediately just popping a golden head or golden apple, you can save a ton of health. However, there's a lot more to worry about than just your health at an intermediate level, because you also have to worry about your positioning. If you let yourself get pushed into a corner too much, you're susceptible to being put in a head web, which, as the name states, is a web put on the opponent's head after you hit him into a wall, followed by blocks to cover the spots they can water from, which is the top and the sides. If you can do this to somebody else, it can basically just win you the entire round. But it goes both ways, where a head web from the opponent could also lose you the round. So try staying away from the walls and focus on keeping the middle of the map to avoid this complete disaster. Intermediate playstyles are where you're going to see a lot more playstyles heavily centered around draining and resource management. This consists of things like bucket drains, bucket refills, and arrow collection. There's not much to say here, so I'm just going to move on to the next section. Melee at an advanced level gets to a really high level, with things like shield pokes, backstabs, momentum breaks, etc. basically being perfected. I personally am a huge fan of momentum breaks and try to do them whenever possible, but that differs for every person. However, the best players are the ones who can switch between all of these things and keep the opponents on their toes at all times. At this stage of the game, your secondaries are going to be your primary stopping tool. Let's take Rosax's High Tier 2 test for example. His playstyle constantly uses waters to create distance for himself to heal, letting him play more aggressive later. And he's got a very good skill in melee, which he takes advantage to in order to take the round. Utility can also be used offensively at a high level too though, with this example from JFEG showing just how strong they can be in terms of drains, lavas, webs, anything of the sort. However, there is a wrong way to use your utility offensively, and it's pretty specific. Let's take Stormplay's Low Tier 2 test for example, where you have my point of view. You can see me get double webbed here, and although he gets 3 of my waters from his double web, he doesn't actually get any damage from it. But then when I double web him and I only get 2 of his waters, you can see I get far more value in terms of HP than him and actually win the round because of it. At this stage of the game, you're going to see the bow popularized far more than in the other stages. This and the crossbow are going to be your main tools to shrink gaps between your health and the opponent's. Especially in endgame situations, your ranged weapons are going to be how you close out rounds. If you take a look at basically any round where both the opponents have space, arrows, and low health, you'll see them both trying to bow as long as you're at a high level. At this stage of the game, everyone's playstyle is going to be a new type, an adaptive playstyle. Players with an adaptive playstyle change how they play according to their opponents. And the difference between players at a high tier skill level around low tier 2 and anything higher around low tier 1 or high tier 1 is how fast they can actually adapt to that kind of stuff. And something else I will talk about at the end of the video. This is Stormplay's Low Tier 2 test. He knows I like to shoot over blocks, so after I get the health advantage with a crossbow shot, he shoots my feet to bring him back to equal, and then predicts the over the top angle to secure the round, which is very well played by him. Or in this scenario, where me and Violewell have fought in so many rounds that I'm able to predict basically his entire utility kit and take the round for myself. Every extraordinary UHC player has something they excel in, compared to the rest of their abilities. If you take any great UHC player, you'll see they excel in something. Whether it's Rosax in melee, JFEG in utilities, and Swite in, well, basically everything, but you get my point. Any good UHC player has a skill that they excel in far more than the rest unless you're at a very, very high level. And in order to improve fast and just get as much value of that as possible, you need to train that skill as best as you can. That's all for the UHC guide. This video took me a very, very long time and was a ton of effort. So if you liked this video and it helped you improve, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share, do whatever you need to do to get this video out to more people, please. Also, keep in mind, I'm only covering the basics in this video, and if you want to improve even further and faster, I'd recommend getting a personal coach at a higher level to review your gameplay, or even just review your own gameplay to see what you're doing wrong in particular. I'm going to leave a pinned comment related to this, and it'd be awesome if you guys could answer that question, please. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.